Hello, our world is full of secret mysteries. Danger can sometimes lurk much closer than we think. Today's story will tell you how even the most ordinary events can turn into a real nightmare for someone. Sometimes people can make bitter enemies, so much so that they are ready to organize crimes committed in cold blood. Even more shocking is how close this enemy can turn out to be. The heroes of today's story lived in Willard in the state of Missouri, USA. This is a small settlement with a close-knit community. Most people here go to church on Sundays. Everyone knows each other well. There is a low crime rate here, and life flows quietly and peacefully. The Porter family acquired a farm in Willard back in 1957. Closer to the tragic events that will be discussed in today's story, it passed into the ownership from the grandfather to Russell Porter, whom everyone called Rusty. He moved here with his wife Rebecca, whom everyone called Becky. On April 19, 2011, 46-year-old Becky unexpectedly didn't show up for her shift. She hadn't notified anyone about health problems, as usually happened. Colleagues, and then management became worried. That same morning, the Porter family's neighbor went out on the porch and saw the car. The Mustang was there, though the neighbor knew that usually, the woman left early in the morning for work in it. The heroine of the story always got up at 7:30 in the morning to make it to the office by 8. The man decided that she wasn't feeling well, so he decided to check how Becky was doing. But no one answered the door knock. The man didn't give it much importance, thinking that everyone in the house was sick and sleeping. When the neighbor didn't see any activity in the house even during the day, he suspected something was wrong. Then Becky's worried daughter Jessica arrived at the house, who couldn't reach her mother. The man approached Jessica and told her about all the strange occurrences. They knocked on the door, but no one opened. Then they looked in the window and saw severe disorder in the house, so they decided to contact the police. Their call became the second, as at this time Becky's son was already talking with law enforcement officers. He reported that he couldn't reach his mother and was worried about her well-being, so he asked to check on the Porter family's condition. As soon as the patrolman arrived at the house, right from the porch, they smelled a strong odor of cleaning products. The officers walked around the house and looked in the window. Inside there was complete devastation, especially in the kitchen and master bedroom. In the center of the room was a bed. The mattress was crooked, the blanket pulled from the bed, and Becky's purse and mobile phone were scattered on the floor. Clear signs of struggle were found here. Everything resembled a crime scene. The police also discovered a cut window screen in the kitchen and assumed that this was how the perpetrator entered the house. Everything looked like a burglary. When the police finally managed to get inside, they saw something contradicting this guess. Despite the apparent theft with breaking and entering, many valuable items remained in their places. Meanwhile, the farmhouse owner wasn't inside. It was obvious that something sinister had happened here. Therefore, the police cordoned off the area and began investigating the suspected kidnapping of the house residents. When Becky's son arrived at the farm, he also helped the police obtain valuable information. What worried him most was that his stepfather's medicine was still here. These were pills that Rusty took daily after treatment. He would not have left the medication under any circumstances when going away for long. Becky's wallet was also found in the master bedroom, which she always carried with her. Her car was still parked outside the house. Bank cards of the woman were found in the cabin. The key remained in the ignition. All this caused concern. Something sinister clearly happened here. Despite the fact that the whole house reeked of cleaning products, only one bottle of bleach was found inside, which remained full. There were no empty cleaning product containers. However, it was obvious that cleaning products had been used very recently. All this looked strange. Someone had clearly thrown them away. It seemed the perpetrator hastily poured chemical products everywhere they could to hide traces. In some places, bleach had collected in whole puddles. A computer monitor was lying on the floor of the office under the desk. However, the system unit was missing. It seemed it had been literally torn out, so several cables remained damaged in place. The police checked and found out that this computer controlled numerous cameras located outside and inside the house. Because the system unit was stolen, all information on the storage devices was also gone. Obviously, the perpetrator took the evidence with them so it wouldn't fall into the hands of detectives. It was also established that the cameras were connected to a unified security system. Shortly before these events, it had sent an alarm signal that remained unanswered. the investigators were troubled by the large number of surveillance cameras. They viewed absolutely all areas of the house without blind spots. These precautions seemed excessive for such a quiet area. They even confused the missing family. Everyone thought that installing the security system was meant to calm Becky. With age, she had become very nervous and fearful. Nevertheless, this caused concern, as the couple lived in a very safe neighborhood where practically everyone knew each other by face. No serious crimes had been committed for years. The police suggested they might have sensed some threat or feared someone. It was believed they might have made an enemy who ultimately dealt with them and kidnapped them. The cleaning products suggested that the perpetrator was trying to remove traces of blood, so investigators suspected the worst. However, the couple's children rejected this possibility. They believed their parents had no enemies. These were peaceful people who rarely had conflicts between themselves and with others, let alone provoking someone to commit a crime. When neighbors learned about the incident, they were also very surprised. The Porters were known as very religious and decent people. They went to church every Sunday, often stayed with neighbors for events. They seemed friendly to everyone. However, those who knew the couple very well told the police that Rusty had a rather difficult past. The man had problems with alcohol and prohibited substances before meeting Becky. This suggested that he might have plunged back into the dark past, accumulated debts, or gotten involved with the wrong people. However, no such movements had been noticed lately. His wife made every possible effort to protect her husband from harmful habits. Despite this, the media immediately picked up the criminal idea. Many neighbors also heard this version, and numerous rumors began circulating around the incident. There were even people convinced of the involvement of a Mexican cartel that could have kidnapped the couple. Meanwhile, the police were working on the version that one spouse could have harmed the other, then fled, or voluntarily ended their life. Despite the use of cleaning products, small drops of blood were found. This only confirmed the police version related to a violent crime. Despite all this, even on the third day of investigation, there was still no physical evidence or leads. The married couple was declared missing. The search continued. It was believed that at least one person had been harmed in this house. It seemed suspicious that both spouses left their daily use items in the house. This meant both could have become crime victims. During this period, the couple's neighbors wondered what could have happened to them. It seemed strange that they just disappeared, and under such circumstances. The longer they didn't appear, the more worried their loved ones and all local residents became. Bloody rumors circulated around the area, and this frightened the entire community. About 5,000 flyers with photos of the missing persons were printed, which volunteers and family members posted around the area. The flyers appeared in all crowded places, from gas stations and grocery stores to truck stops. This attracted the local biker community, which actively helped with the search, including questioning local residents. A reward was announced for information about the couple's whereabouts. While detectives actively communicated with relatives and friends of the missing persons, they collected information about the immediate environment and looked for potential killers or kidnappers. Any conflict situations and disagreements with other people that the Porters might have encountered in recent days and months could help with this. Thus, it was discovered that a family member named Rob Campbell had a conflict with Rusty. The 66-year-old man was his uncle. He drove a pickup truck and lived near the Porters. The elderly man with a nasty temper became the main suspect in this case. Investigators began to study the circumstances of his life and relationship with Rusty in more detail. It turned out that they had been in conflict for quite a while, and periodically had outbursts of anger between them. By the time of the couple's disappearance, the situation between them had become so aggravated that about 3 weeks before, each of them received a restraining order against the other. Naturally, detectives arrived at the elderly man's doorstep to talk with him about the last days before Rusty and Becky's disappearance. As it turned out, Rob claimed this farm, although legally he had no rights to it. The elderly man lived on its territory for some time until new owners moved in. The owner's grandson, Rusty, who inherited the farm from his grandfather and his wife. Rob was unhappy with these circumstances, believing he had every right to live on the farm as the owner's son. But due to poor relations, he wasn't mentioned in the will. All conflicts occurred over property. Rob offered to split the farm in half with the new owners, but Rusty refused. After showing the property rights documents, the man harbored a grudge. He considered his claims to half the property justified. Even before Rusty and Becky moved in, Rob was involved in construction. He restored the house facade, built the second floor, replaced the roof. After this, he bought a new trailer, and then the porters unexpectedly arrived, who literally evicted him from the territory and didn't want to hear about his investments in the house. According to documents, Rob had no rights to the house, which Rusty and Becky explained to him. Therefore, investing in someone else's house was pointless. This didn't give him the right to receive half the property. Nevertheless, Rob insisted that Becky and Rusty should vacate the territory or somehow otherwise share with him the right to use it, perhaps pay compensation. At minimum, he wanted to recover his investment in construction and repairs, but they couldn't reach any agreement. The problem was escalating, and no one was going to solve it. All this provided a good reason to get rid of the spouses and take possession of the property. Detectives noticed that Rob behaved very possessively towards the property, which originally belonged to the porter's grandmother and grandfather, and wasn't inherited by him. He was deeply offended by all family members, especially Rusty and Becky. Eventually, due to conflicts, he moved his new trailer half a kilometer from the farmhouse. The man seemed to have a strong motive for assault, kidnapping, or even murder, given the long history of conflicts between the men. At the same time, Rob denied any involvement in the couple's disappearance, insisting on his alibi. It turned out he was indeed in another city 150 kilometers from home on a business trip with his wife on the day of the murder. Despite the alibi, it seemed the police had answers to all questions. Robert Campbell lived a few hundred meters from the couple. He clearly claimed their property. A restraining order was obtained against him. Probably, all surveillance cameras on the farm territory were also installed for protection against him. Witnesses were found who repeatedly saw conflicts between the men. For example, once Robert drove past the family home and shouted in the window that they wouldn't stay here long. All this could be perceived as a threat. Rob could have hired killers and not personally participated in the couple's kidnapping. The man had a real motive, but could he really raise his hand against his relative and his wife? As it turned out, several people harbored resentment against the story's heroes. The Porters officially got married just a year before their disappearance. Becky was married before meeting her new love. Her first husband was a local church pastor named Terrence. The divorce process was complicated and very controversial, and 4 months later, Becky met Rusty. During this period, the man had problems with prohibited substances and alcohol. However, as soon as he met his companion, she became a real breath of fresh air for him. It seemed from the beginning she tried to get him out of this dependent state. Rusty himself admitted that thanks to her he felt a zest for life that he had already forgotten. Becky was older than Rusty. The difference between them was more than 10 years. This fact even somewhat confused the young man's family members, but everyone quickly got used to it. However, Becky's family took what happened more severely. After the divorce, she lived with her children and parents, but they didn't like Rusty. As a result, the children stayed living with their grandmother and grandfather. They began communicating less with their mother due to her persistent desire to tie her fate to such a young man with serious addictions. They even refused to attend their wedding. Such discord wasn't unusual. Would it hardly give anyone a motive for attack? However, the complicated divorce process with Terrence looked suspicious. In particular, during married life, the couple opened a restaurant, which they owned together. No one wanted to divide the business during the divorce. Thus, the financial motive could give Becky's first husband a substantial reason to do something terrible to his ex and her new young spouse. Detectives couldn't find any other potential suspects. Now the investigation was working on two versions. The first suspect was Uncle Robert Campbell, who had very tense relations with Rusty. The second was former husband Terrence Fraser, who might have had financial claims against Becky. The police approached the former husband, the church pastor, to learn from him the circumstances of his relationship with Becky in recent days and months. However, unlike Rusty's uncle, from the beginning he behaved like a grief-stricken ex-husband. He seemed sincerely upset by her disappearance. His behavior was very different from Robert's. They hadn't had any conflict situations lately. The man lived his life and even seemed happy. He sincerely regretted all the disagreements that arose with his ex-wife during the divorce. He thought that in some moments he could have behaved much softer, and was wrong. Meanwhile, the police continued communicating with the Porters' close ones and friends. One of Rusty's friends shared new interesting information. As it turned out, various property crimes had repeatedly occurred on the family's residence territory. This meant they could actually have had many more enemies that no one knew about. This well explained the numerous cameras and security system located on the family home territory. Detectives also learned about a recent incident when agricultural equipment was stolen from the family farm territory. This happened several months before the disappearance. According to one of Rusty's friends, video cameras appeared immediately after this case. Robert Campbell was checked for possible involvement in this event. It turned out that he couldn't have done anything like this during this period as he was far from the city. However, apparent hatred for his nephew could have pushed the relative to order a crime. During the attack period, he worked as a long-haul truck driver and went to Texas. After checking, it turned out that the pastor was also uninvolved. This suggested that the Porters could have had several non-obvious enemies about whom the police still didn't know. At some point, it seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end until unexpected progress appeared. About a week after Rusty and Becky's disappearance, early in the morning, a call came to the station. Witnesses discovered Donald and Helen Willingham stabbed to death in their home. The police immediately noticed many similar moments in the crimes. Both houses were invaded without warning. Nothing valuable was stolen. Meanwhile, the new victims were dealt with particular cruelty. However, unlike the first case, in the second, no one had time to dispose of the bodies and try to clean up traces of the massacre. The reason was simple. The fact was that the criminal was scared off by a neighbor. He even pursued for some time a person in a black hoodie with a hood on the road. Unfortunately, the cutthroat managed to escape. After this, the neighbor immediately called the station around 5 o'clock in the morning. Police began analyzing the circumstances of death and life of the second incident's victims. As it turned out, the family was very similar to the Porters. In particular, both women were active participants in local church life. Helen was married to Donald Willingham, a local church pastor. All this led to disturbing thoughts about a serial killer or connection between these families. However, despite all the efforts of law enforcement officers, there was no tangible progress in either case. The Willinghams' relatives, their immediate surroundings, and the chronology of preceding events were also thoroughly checked. Several suspects were found, as in the case with the Porters, but during personal communication, they were quite quickly crossed off this list. It seemed both cases had reached a dead end. The situation was destined to change only in July 2011. During this period, a man named Hackleberry was brought to the station. He was detained on charges of burglary committed in Greene County. His interrogation lasted 7.5 hours, during which he confessed that he was responsible for Mr. and Mrs. Willingham's death, but he denied his involvement in the Porters' disappearance. Subsequently, it was proven that he indeed couldn't have attacked them. He had a solid alibi. Between the crimes, there were not only many similarities, but also a large number of key differences. In particular, the motives and killer's signature didn't match, so he was excluded from the list of suspects in the Porters case. Then a police informant was released from prison, who said he had valuable information about the Porter couple. According to him, an inmate named Tony bragged during conversation that he took Rusty and Becky's birthdays. This was criminal world slang that criminals used to say they had dealt with some people. Detectives treated his words with reasonable skepticism. Nevertheless, this investigative direction probably shouldn't be ignored. It was decided to check Tony. First, the police decided to check his mobile phone data, in particular, geolocation, to understand if he could have been near the Porter's house on the night of their disappearance. Meanwhile, detectives checked Tony's background. It turned out that he regularly committed burglaries. He primarily specialized in electronics and household appliances. Overall, the signature matched, including the system unit that the criminal stole from the house could confirm involvement. During the investigation, the inmate was in prison, awaiting charges for another burglary. Detectives decided to talk to him personally. Nevertheless, he insisted that he had nothing to do with Rusty and Becky's disappearance. Close ones described Tony as a troubled man from his earliest years. He always got into trouble, and was connected to the criminal world since school times. Investigators also spoke with the man's family. It turned out that a split had occurred among them long ago. Some relatives hadn't seen Tony for several years. They had no idea what was happening with him. Others maintained contact. For example, Tony's cousin Dusty Hicks, who from the very beginning actively cooperated with the investigation. After some time, Tony reported that he possibly had information about the crime related to the Porters. He said he wanted to show the police one place where the Porters' bodies were located. This was Tony's old cabin, a kind of shelter made in the forest. The officers went to the location. The closer the group got to this cabin, the stronger the unpleasant smell became. When law enforcement officers got inside, it was almost unbearable. Here they found a hole in the floor, and under the wooden flooring was a grave with garbage and human remains in the ground. 3 months had passed since the married couple's disappearance. Naturally, the condition of the bodies was poor. Therefore, at first glance, it was impossible to say who exactly was in police custody. Forensic examination was required to identify the victims. Finally, the expert was able to determine through dental records and DNA that Rusty and Rebecca Porter were indeed on his table. The case was officially reclassified from disappearance to double murder when it was determined how the spouses were killed. Each received a point-blank gunshot to the head. As forensics experts say, they received contact wounds from firearms. The murdered were in their pajamas, probably caught by surprise at night or early morning when they were sleeping. Meanwhile, it seemed strange that the bodies ended up far from their home in the forest. It was difficult and time-consuming to get here. How could an ordinary person know about everything? Everything turned out to be simple. Tony's cousin Dusty Hicks was an accomplice. The cousin revealed that Tony had a real gang. It included several of his childhood friends. Together, the young people regularly committed crimes. As a rule, they just robbed houses to profit at others' expense. There were no violent crimes on their list. At least until the Porters were discovered. Dusty confessed that besides himself and Tony, the main criminal's wife named Windy Friend and Tony's son Philip also participated in the massacre. It was decided to check phone call records between the participants. Suspicious correspondence between Tony and his son was discovered. Tony, Windy, Philip, and Dusty were detected near the Porter's house on April 18th. However, the devices were turned off several hundred meters before the farm. The suspects were interrogated and confessed that a certain client offered them $100,000 for the double murder. Tony, as the oldest and more experienced, drew his own son and other people into criminal activity, luring them with money. According to the suspect's confession, they used special adhesive film wrapped around their hands to avoid leaving traces. Furthermore, before arriving at the Porters, they purchased a whole bottle of bleach, which they later used to clean traces at the crime scene. At the farm, they disabled surveillance cameras by cutting the wires. This was why an alarm signal was sent. After cutting the screen, the perpetrators were able to get inside through the window. Tony was armed with a sawed-off shotgun, while the others just helped him. The man entered the master bedroom and pointed the firearm at the awakening Rusty and Becky. After this, he ordered the participants to immobilize their future victims with plastic ties. Both were kidnapped and taken in a pickup truck towards a remote forest area. The married couple was dropped off near a cabin in the forest, where both bodies were later discovered. According to Philip's confession, his father and Dusty immediately led the captives into the forest. About 10 minutes later, he heard a shot, and a couple of minutes later, another one. Probably at this moment, the Porters were gone. Then the bodies were thrown into an improvised grave. The perpetrators returned to the victim's house, cleaned up to hide traces, and stole the computer to take the camera recordings. Of course, the police were most interested in who ordered this crime, who was ready to pay $100,000 for 2 innocent people. One name was named, and it was quite logical: Robert Campbell. According to the cutthroat, the uncle wanted to get rid of his nephew and his wife, not only because he was evicted. In fact, they knew something more about him, a terrible secret that cost them their lives. However, no details of this secret were voiced. Later, it turned out that Rusty and Rebecca believed that Robert was running an illegal business and selling stolen equipment. They were gathering information about this and planning to go to the police. Robert, naturally, couldn't allow this. He contacted his acquaintance Tony, and he brought in others to commit the murder. The whole company was detained. Robert Campbell stated, "I swear on the Bible, I didn't do this." But the police didn't believe him. The prosecution brought charges against all 5 criminals. Tony Friend pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Dusty Hicks was sentenced to 2 life terms. Windy Friend was sentenced to life imprisonment. Philip Friend testified against his accomplices, so his sentence was reduced. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison. Only in 2016 did Robert Campbell appear before court. The evidence against him was circumstantial. The criminal was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. They even wanted to prosecute Robert's wife Carolyn for complicity and perjury. But she committed suicide before being charged with anything.